It is now my pleasure to introduce this year's Convocation speaker, Professor Mark Pohlmann. Professor Pohlmann is a beloved professor who has taught at Rhodes since 1986 and was chair of the Department of Political Science for 16 years. He has coached the college's highly competitive intercollegiate mock trial team to 4 national championships. Professor Pohlmann has had a powerful impact on students in his 31-year, now going on 32-year career at Rhodes. As a result of Professor Pohlmann's achievements, he was named the 2017 recipient of the Clarence Day Award for Outstanding Teaching, the college's highest teaching award. I'm delighted that he has accepted our invitation to deliver the opening Convocation address. Please join me in welcoming Professor Pohlmann.
Thank you, Milton, for that kind introduction, and good afternoon. There is, in fact, a certain risk inviting a political scientist to give this talk. Just what is it that political scientists know the best and are likely to talk about? That would be politics. In this current political climate, that can be risky. It could actually provoke some people. So, of course, I will be talking about politics. But more specifically, why you should be careful not to let your politics interfere with your learning. The title of today's talk is Learning to Learn, and the lesson is simple. If you come to Rhodes and wear ideological blinders, you are not going to learn nearly as much as you could otherwise. And your country and your world will be worse for it. Let me repeat that. If you come to Rhodes and wear ideological blinders, you aren't going to learn nearly as much as you could otherwise, and your country and world will be worse for it. You students are at college at a critical point in our country's history. It's your time to open your eyes and your minds widely, using both the many opportunities Rhodes will provide and using the vast array of information at your fingertips. It's your time to change the course of American history and to find answers to pressing issues. Do not settle for bumper sticker solutions that fit neatly into a comfortable, preformed way of thinking. Question everything, explore openly, and validate thoroughly. I'll repeat those. Question everything, explore openly, and validate thoroughly. I will return to those at the end of the talk, but for now, we, the students of the past, now adults, those who have been students and preceded you, have been dropping the ball. Contemporary headlines read, "We're coming apart. We're becoming the disunited states of America." This growing phenomenon is fed to a large extent by what has come to be called media silos, those being echo chambers where we tend to congregate and communicate with those who already think like we do. As we congregate in those silos, we adults are increasingly closing our minds to new information and to points of view that don't already adhere to our own worldviews. And in doing so, we are closing ourselves off from each other and from critical pieces of information. We are also making it nearly impossible to arrive at productive compromises, especially when our closed-mindedness and separation lapses into demonizing each other. This has become even more problematic because we live in an ever more diverse country in an ever-shrinking world. So how polarized are we today? Congressman Steve Scalise, shot in Washington, D.C. because he was a Republican elected official. Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, shot in Arizona, at least in part, because of her Democratic political views. Less dramatic, but still troubling, is the misinformation and hostility that seem to divide everyday people. 2/3 of Republicans view Democrats, quote unquote, very unfavorably. More than half of all Democrats see Republicans the same way. And those numbers have tripled since 1994. When asked, would you be displeased if your child married outside of your political party? In 1960, only 4% of Republicans and Democrats answered yes. Today, nearly half of all Republicans feel that way, and roughly 1/3 of all Democrats do. Only 9% of people with the party identification currently marry outside of their political party. As we speak, only 1/4 of all Republicans are certain that Barack Obama was born in the United States. Approximately 40% still believed him to be a Muslim. Many of those Republicans also mistrust the majority of major news sources, and half rely exclusively on Fox for all their news. Democrats, on the other hand, have become comparably suspicious of Republicans, and especially President Trump. And many of them find themselves gravitating more and more to MSNBC for the bulk of their information. Meanwhile, the possibility of reaching common ground seems to shrink with each passing day. In 2009, even before President Obama was inaugurated and had proposed a single piece of legislation, Republican congresspersons threw down the gauntlet. In the words of one former Republican elected official, quote, if Obama was for it, we had to be against it, unquote. That position seemed to hold for pretty much all 8 of his years as President of the United States. As President Trump was inaugurated and began to articulate his agenda, 88% of Republicans approved of his efforts, only 8% of Democrats did. Meanwhile, a magazine out of New York City headlined as follows, "No sympathy for the hillbilly." In that article, Trump voters were seen as duped, and the fact that they had lost dignity, autonomy, and health care was said to be exactly what they deserved. So we cower for protection in our partisan and ideological silos where oversimplification and misinformation can abound. For example, Democrats thought 1/3 of Republicans made more than $250,000 a year. Correct answer, 2%. Republicans thought 1/3 of all Democrats identified with LGBTQ. Reality, 6%. And even more troubling, those who seem to care the most, those with the strongest feelings about these things, are actually the most ill-informed. A political scientist at Stanford University's conservative Hoover Institute by the name of Shanto Iyengar concluded several things related to our national divisions. For example, quote, if you go back to the days of the Civil War, one can find cases in American political history where there was far more rancor and violence. But in the modern era, Iyengar goes on, there's no ifs and buts. Partisan animus is at an all-time high. Surveys over time have used a 100-point thermometer scale to rate how voters feel about each other from warm to cold. Democrats and Republicans have been giving lower and lower scores to the opposing party. Last year, for the first time ever, the most common answer given was 0, the worst possible option. In other words, voters on the left and right now feel downright frigid towards one another. That negativity appears to have fed a growing perception that the opposing party isn't just misguided, but it's dangerous. In a 2016 Pew Research Center poll, they reported nearly half of all Republicans and Democrats felt the other party's policies posed a threat to the nation's well-being. When asked why they identified as a Republican, 2/3 of the respondents told Pew that a major factor was the harm that Democratic policies posed, surpassing the number and percentage who cited the good that their own party's policies could accomplish. Among Democrats, the numbers were very similar. Opposing partisans are also likely to find each other harder to reason with. Last year, Pew found that 70% of Democrats and 52% of Republicans considered members of the opposing party to be more closed-minded than other Americans. Significant shares also considered opposing partisans exceptionally immoral, lazy, and dishonest. About 1/3 of both parties viewed the opposition as less intelligent than other Americans. So how did we get here? A good bit of this appears to be attributable to what political scientists have come to refer to as a polarization industrial complex. Political scientists suspect that campaign attack ads, which have grown in number and nastiness, have played a role. And the rise of partisan media has amplified the rhetoric of campaigns, continually feeding our worst stereotypes of each other. Mr. Iyengar also points out that Americans are willing to impugn members of the other party in ways that aren't considered publicly acceptable when talking about groups like minorities, women, or gays. There simply aren't strong social norms holding partisans back from saying really nasty things about each other. The 24/7 news cycle, desperate for stories that will hold their audience, also is a possible culprit. They tend to hyper-sensationalize, stroke fears, and validate bizarre stories and behavior for an increasingly fearful audience, leading potentially dangerous rumors like Pizzagate, which led an otherwise sane man by the name of Edgar Madison Welch to drive from North Carolina and enter the Comet Pizza Parlor in Washington, D.C., armed with a loaded assault rifle, looking for the alleged child sex ring purportedly coordinated by Hillary Clinton and going on in the basement of that family restaurant. Social scientists Jeffrey Berry and Sarah Soberaj concluded that it is, quote, worrisome because it represents the growth of an industry that makes profits in large part by peddling political outrage and fueling the fires of polarization. They conclude that such peddling of outrage coarsens and demonizes our political discourse. That needs to stop. One ray of hope seems to be that as a country, we are gradually starting to realize the dangers inherent in this kind of divisiveness. More than 85% of Americans believe political polarization is, quote, threatening to the American way of life. So what does any of that have to do with you and your learning? Over the next 4 years, you aren't going to change the demonization silos, but you can step outside of them in this unique and guarded space called college, and you can learn to learn. In part, we demonize each other because we have come to be convinced that we are right, guided by principles that we are convinced are somehow the only correct way to view things. College is going to be the best time in your life to broaden your thinking and establish a pattern of intellectual inquisitiveness that will hopefully last for a lifetime. Intellectual inquisitiveness as opposed to lockstep ideology. I have 3 suggestions for you, whether you're a first-year student or a senior. Question everything, explore openly, and validate thoroughly. Let's talk about each one of those. Number 1, first, question everything. Don't retreat to your ideological silo and succumb to what psychologists call cognitive consonance. That means, if you don't already know, is attempting to make the world's signals fit your preformed ideology. So you change the information you hear to fit what you already think. This will be difficult, it will hurt to get outside of those. Some friends and family members won't understand, and they may condemn you, but persevere. Question absolutely everything. That is a critical place to start. Second, explore openly, read broadly, truly listen to each other. Venture outside of your comfort zone. Forget that triple minor and take more F9 courses exploring different cultural perspectives. You can only learn with your eyes open and your minds open. Thirdly, validate thoroughly. Again, avoid bumper sticker solutions. Avoid what's come to be called the fact-free universe. Yes, facts can be determined, at least until they are disproven by even more rigorous investigation. Here's an example. I don't like guns, but I listened and I read, and now I do understand what an AR-15 actually is and does. Meanwhile, my pro-gun friends need to listen to our legitimate concerns as well, so that we can all look into ways of further guaranteeing that only trained, responsible people have and can activate deadly weaponry. The gun rights people have to be able to trust that the gun control people will not come after the guns of the trained, safe, law-abiding gun owners. The gun control people have to be able to trust that the gun owners will join the fight to take guns out of the hands of those not trained and responsible. Remember, you can remain true to your own personal values and still learn. And you can also remain true to your values and still find common ground with those who don't necessarily think exactly as you do. Common ground compromises that will allow a large, heterogeneous society to function. Let's begin by not demonizing each other without first listening to each other, and by exploring all possible alternatives. That openness needs to impact the classes you take, the people you spend time with, the places you go, the speakers and films you choose to attend, and yes, the conversations you have. Be open so you can learn to learn. You and your society will be better for it. Thank you.